My name's Nat, and I work at an organization called Exceptional Individuals. We're a social enterprise that supports people who are neurodivergent. Like myself, a lot of my team are neurodiverse. So we specialize by being an expert via experience. And I'm also currently doing a master's in neuroscience. So I'm combining a nice bit of theory with a bit of lived experience and smushing it together in order to kind of come up with some understanding what it means to think differently. A bit of a disclaimer for today. I'm going to be talking about some controversial things, okay? And some of you aren't going to like it, and that's okay. Let's keep the debate friendly, but feel free to challenge each other's views. I genuinely want to hear what your viewpoints are and change mine if you can, and maybe I'll try and change yours, and hopefully we'll somewhere meet in the middle. So with that, I think we can now get going. So as I say, this is our organization. We specialize in different ways of thinking. Here's this lovely bunch. Now, the last webinar we done, which some of you attended, which was great, was the history of madness. So the first one we did was the abstract idea of neurodiversity, kind of breaking apart. What do we mean by the word neurodiversity? And we looked at it from going from a point of disability to neurodivergence. Then when we went from last week, we did the history of madness. We were going back in time a little bit. We were looking back at the old history. So from the conception of madness to disability. So we're kind of getting up to date now. Is it the right word? We've looked at why we now use neurodiversity as an organization, but is it the right term in all different phrases? Is it sometimes best to call it an illness? Is it sometimes better to call it a disorder or a difference? And again, everyone has different point of views. I have my views, but it's very useful to understand other people's views. And then maybe you can start understanding their perspective. From what I found out from doing this research is it kind of depends on the person's profession, to be honest with you, or kind of the intent you want. If you're trying to empower someone, maybe the word disorder isn't going to be the most uplifting. But if you're trying to get clinical medical help or trying to get help on, say, the NHS, maybe you want a word like disorder because it kind of it strikes fear into people, like you should probably get help. So illness, disorder, difference, or other. Now, some of these words, right, they are meant to kind of like ruffle your feathers. Like the idea of illness is quite an extreme version. And whether or not any of you feel that way, I'd be surprised. But I still want to investigate it, still kind of break it apart. If we know being neurodiverse is not an illness, why do we know that? And if we can better understand it, maybe we can verbalize it to others to help them understand. Disorder, well, a lot of us may feel that's quite a negative word. However, that is the official terminology. And difference is more of a softer approach, but there isn't any kind of clinical weight behind it. And there are maybe some other terms that we've not thought of, which might be more universal or better in particular situations going forward. So today we're looking at the construct of neurodevelopmental illnesses, disorder, and neurodiversity. What we mean at what even is it? How did it come about? How are we kind of putting it together? Oh, April says, out of those terms, I prefer difference because neurodiverse people think in a different way from non-neurodiverse person. Thanks, April. That's a really good insight. And I'm very much on the similar wavelength as you at the moment. But this research, again, might open up some of your eyes a little bit. So question to all of you. How do you currently, right now, see neurodivergence? Do you see it as an illness, a disorder, or a difference or other? And I really want to emphasize, though we all have our own individual views, I will say there's not necessarily a wrong answer. So please don't shame anyone for having views that are different to your own. I don't think anyone would in this group, but it's always good to say to create a nice environment. All right, so the vast majority of you say difference, and some of you say disorder and other. And I'd love to know why. Don't just tell me why. Gail says it's a superpower. Good on you, Gail. Now, do you know what? I'm going to share my 2 cents on that. Because for me personally, and I'm not kind of taken away from you, I don't like calling it a superpower because it puts a lot of pressure on me to be amazing. I'm all right. But it can be a superpower in certain situations and moments, but in other parts in life, it can be really challenging. That's why I'm not a fan of always saying superpower, but I do appreciate that for those who have only seen it as a negative, by kind of changing the term around to kind of focus solely on the benefits can be really empowering. Okay, Ant says, someone once told me my ADHD was a superpower. I was like, okay. Yeah, I get that, because it depends who's telling you, isn't it? If it's someone who has ADHD and they can kind of explain why, but if it's some neurotypical person says it's a superpower and you're like, listen, mate, I can barely keep my concentration for like 2 seconds, you start to wonder. Claude says, depends on too many factors to select just one answer. Right. There are going to be things today where you are kind of forced to choose like black or white. I know life has more dimensions. Okay, what do we have? A lot of official things here in the US identify it as a disability. So you can constantly have to check off that you have a disability on paperwork. Yeah, that is true. Same in the UK. Things are going along the lines of allowing people to choose what they resonate with. Officially, it is a disability, at least in the UK, I can speak for, but that doesn't mean that a lot of us would willingly choose that if it wasn't for, official forms. Anna says, I think it depends on how far your journey is. Yep, that's a really good one. Oh, Emma says, surviving neuronormality is quite a fear for us. That makes it a bit of a superpowered. Yeah, no, I can agree with that. Olawal, again, sorry for pronouncing your name. I'll do my best. To me, it can overlap between disorder and ability. It is a result of an individual's traits and environment that they find themselves in. Interesting. You guys are good. I'm liking these detailed answers. And what's the next one? It sometimes feels like it's an illness. It does stand in its way of flourishing at times, but at other times it can feel just like a difference. Oh, see, that's quite an interesting one. So it can be both pending. So Peter Tyrer, really interesting chap, wrote some amazing books. He says it's not a mental illness. And this is his reasoning for saying why being neurodiverse is not. He says the name mental illness implies disease. Now, disease doesn't sound great. You think, I got a disease. It's something you can gain, it's something you can get rid of. That just doesn't really gel when it comes to being neurodiverse. Now, obviously, we weren't ever implying that it was a disease, but it was still good to ask the question. Then he goes on to say an illness, however, suggests something wrong that is fundamentally different from normal function and is not just a variation in degree. So this is, again, quite interesting. Is this referring to neurodivergence? Something which wrong that is fundamentally different from normal function? Well, let's say you have autism. It's potentially wrong if you struggle to integrate into society, and it is substantially different. However, it is a variant. So you tell me. So with this in mind, do you consider neurodivergence an illness? Is it an illness or is it not an illness? Okay, the issue for me is society is not getting it as discriminating. Well, that says Bob, but it's not. Okay, really interesting. Okay, not an illness. Yes, I personally would say it is not an illness. It just doesn't kind of match up. Because again, if we go back to what Peter says, an illness suggests something wrong that is fundamentally different from normal function. Now, is it fundamentally? That's a big word here. So there's some really kind of big words. It's not just a variation in degree. So essentially, it's not just a spectrum, it's more than that. How do we answer? So there's a mixture here. An illness suggests something wrong. Now, it's always interesting to see where people's minds are. We also know that we've got an international audience today, so maybe that's going to have some impact. The next one I want to talk about is from Thomas Szasz. Not sure how to pronounce his name, from a book on the myth of mental illness. And you might be thinking, Nat, why are you focusing so much on mental illness? Well, truth be told, neurodiversity is a relatively new term. The kind of level of detail we're going into, it hasn't always been applied in that context. So a lot of the things we're doing today is we're taking research that was done on mental health and we're applying it to neurodiversity. So kind of keep that in mind. Or Emma says, not a fan of the word normal in Peter's definition of illness. Thanks, Emma, for that. That's a good, interesting way of putting it as well. In this quote, it says, mental illness is a metaphor. The word disease denotes a demonstrable biological process that affects the body of living organisms. Again, big words, but essentially like some sort of parasite, something which is kind of like feeding off of you, really kind of unnatural. This is a much more clearer way of saying, yeah, definitely doesn't count being neurodiverse. The term mental illness refers to the undesirable thoughts, feelings, and behavior of a person. Now, this one, I think, again, it becomes a bit more difficult, doesn't it? Because some people might say having OCD or having ADHD is undesirable thoughts, an undesirable feeling, and undesirable behavior, but not everyone would. So you tell me, with this definition, I think it's clear to say it's definitely not a disease, but does it count as a mental illness? And it depends, doesn't it? Claudia answers, depends on how much neurodivergence causes difficulty in daily life. Yeah, again, for some of us, it's just something which is a bit of a quirk. For others of us, it can be completely debilitating. Lucy says, it feels impossible to answer. For me, autism makes me feel different, but my ADHD/autism feels like an absolute illness. I feel like it's different, but I had to be diagnosed as a child, so it's all too different for everyone. Do you know what, Lucy? I completely get you. My autism, for me, is just a different way that I think and process the world. It's part of my character and my personality. My OCD tendencies, though, feels like an illness. It really does. And I struggle a lot with it. So, it's a tough one. Maybe everyone should not try to put everyone in a box. Anthony, we are definitely going to be talking about whether or not putting people in a box is beneficial or not today. So yeah, good question. I worry that if we say it isn't an illness, we deny some of the level of pain/struggle involved. Again, that's a really interesting point. The struggle is real. And this goes back to the point why some of us might not like the term superpower, because it denies the real struggle that some of us go through. Does this, and to what degree, does this keep me from integrating on my daily life? Yeah, see, that's another thing as well. It depends how easily you kind of maneuver society. Oh, I love the debate today is really great. Gail says, if society was dominated by neurodivergent people, then we wouldn't feel disadvantaged. I say superpower because I can do things others cannot. I can cope with things others can't. That is true. I always say being neurodiverse is not a disability inherently, but it's disabiliting by society. When I'm in groups which allow me to thrive in a way that my brain works, absolutely I see it as a superpower. Tracy says, depends on what is considered undesirable behaviors. These behaviors are decided by society, which is built around being neurotypical. Bang on, Tracy. That is a really Tonian way of saying it. All right, so the next question is, so we know that ND is not an illness, or at least most of us would agree upon that. Should neurodivergence, ND, be treated like a mental illness? Now, think about this one, right? We're not saying it is a mental illness. We're saying, should it be treated like a mental illness? So what do we mean by that? Well, mental illnesses might seek support from the government. There might be institutions that can help. You might be entitled to medication, maybe therapy. If we're saying it's dissimilar completely, would we be entitled to any support? Okay, what we got? Oh no. Okay, we've got mine is a real struggle because I don't adapt to new environments easily. I'm always afraid of new people. Okay, this isn't okay. Yeah, should ND be treated like a mental illness? Yes or no? It's all 50-50. Honestly, I don't know. I do not know. When my neurodivergence was affecting my life quite significantly, I did seek mental health support. Now, was it an illness or not? I don't know. I think 50-50 is probably a good place to leave this because the answer is quite grey. Tracy has just said support from a therapist can help the newly diagnosed navigate their new way of being, learning to accept who we are. Emma says abstain. hard to be mentally ill when talking to disability. So many comments coming in. Hard to be talking about disability support. Terrible to be treated as mentally ill when sitting in a meeting at work. That is true, because we are obviously stigmatized as a neurodiverse community, but you may argue that those with mental illness have an even heavier bias or discrimination between them. Or maybe not heavier, but like different. Do we really want to like put one aside for another? So if not an illness or a disorder, then what? What are we calling this? Bob says society treatment of the unknown dyslexia for 60 years perpetuated anxiety and depression. Yeah, unfortunately, when things aren't diagnosed, it kind of manifests in other areas. So while it may not be a mental illness at the start, it kind of does turn into a mental illness eventually because of the way that life treats you. So maybe going to the same kind of departments of mental health is the right way to do. I mean, we all know that budgets are tight. Do we need our own separate kind of institution? I don't know. Anna says, yeah, but we have different brains by default from start, which isn't the cause of any mental illness. You're right, Anna. But we were in a society which created a normal way of thinking. So society has created that disability. Now, we could argue whether or not whose fault it is for creating that disability, but the fact is society isn't going to change like that. So it's, it's the chicken or the egg kind of scenario. Oh, Bob says neurodiverse people are predisposed to mental illness. To bridge the gap, society fails to provide care within. Yes, to the degree that it necessary for the individual. Did I mention I have severe dyslexia? So please excuse me for the reading. Should have noted by society's attitudes. So the next thing is the neurodiversity movement. We talked about why it isn't this, it isn't that, but then what is it? Now, we've mentioned the neurodiversity movement before in previous webinars, but let's have a bit of a recap. This is a movement which talks about reframing what we consider different. So the movement essentially would not treat being neurodiverse. Obviously, there's fractions in this movement, but as a whole, they're saying there is nothing wrong with thinking different, and thus there is nothing to treat. So if there's nothing to treat, you wouldn't really call it a mental illness or a disease or anything which requires treatment, this would no longer cover. Now, they believe variations in neurological development, so when the brain kind of grows and develops, as some of you are saying, that it's completely natural and it's a valuable part of human variation. It's not dissimilar from biology, how we have different plants and different animals. And, I'm not comparing us to Hassing with different animals, but you know what I mean? Difference is a natural, normal, healthy part of human existence. So this is what the movement is saying. And I can see a lot of you probably think, this is great. I'm loving the sound of this movement. But it's not without its critics. And understanding why some people may not be in favor of this can be really interesting in bridging that debate. One thing I do struggle with is when we believe so heavily that something is right, it can make it very difficult to empathize with someone who thinks differently from us. And so there's a bit of irony in it, isn't there? That we're talking about accepting difference, but maybe not all of us are willing to accept difference in thoughts, even if they're not the most progressive. Well, we got, yes, I do agree with that. For example, here in Nigeria, it's even worse here because of parental care, guardians and all, etc. In the current society, it adds to it because we are at the mercy of those who are mentally okay. That's an interesting way of putting it. From what I took from that, it's saying that neurotypical people, the average, are the people who dictate our laws, rules, medication, and treatment. So that's also to be taken into consideration. So next question. The neurodiversity movement would not treat neurodivergence, okay? There is nothing to treat with ND. Do you agree or disagree? When it comes to neurodivergence, maybe from your own personal perspective or someone else, is there anything to treat? Again, this isn't a simple question. I think it depends so much on your own personal circumstances and viewpoints. NDs are here to clear up the mess that NTs made of the world. God makes no mistakes. Disagree, define, treats, please. Okay, there is nothing to treat with ND. From what I understood, we mean kind of like support, therapy, medication, any sort of difficulty or challenge that comes with being neurodiverse. So this doesn't have to be like in a biological sense. It could also just be a more like softer societal approach. Now, a lot of you disagree. And I think the wording is what makes it difficult, isn't there? There is nothing to treat. Well, if someone is neurodiverse, right, let's say autism, and they have hypersensitivity and they struggle with loud sounds, are we saying we just leave them be? Or do we kind of help them kind of desensitize, kind of become more kind of adapted to loud sounds so they can navigate the world around them? If someone has ADHD and they really struggle to remain concentrated and medication would help them kind of regain some control, it's tough. For me, the biggest thing is whether or not we force it upon people. I think it comes down to personal choice. But then what do we do for children? Like they cannot choose for themselves. Is it then up to the parents? Bob says society generally thinks differently and would say agree. So yeah, we've got a mixture here. Oh, Daniela says, I see the treatment is learning the set of skills required to function in common society. Yeah, so when we say treat, maybe we're just talking about teaching and learning. I would say so. Treat could mean many, many different things. So I guess we're going to keep that open for debates. Oh, we got when society gives no leeway for individuals to be neurodivergent, it in fact demands they think exactly the way they deem correct. There needs to be support. I see it almost like a translator. Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. Is we think a different way, it helps. ADHD medication has helped me to be able to function, and for many, many people it has as well. But for some people, no. Imagine if you are forced to take ADHD medication. That would completely change it, wouldn't it? So we've got most people would disagree. And I'm really pleased that we're getting like a diverse set of results here. Gail says hypersensitivity individuals need to be in a silent environment where they can flourish in their own way. Now, could that be seen as a way of treatment? We've got, to me, I still feel it needs to be a lot of consideration. It's just a gap that needs to fill in the body of knowledge. Analyzing all the foundation circumstances that adds to it will create a breakthrough, aside creating awareness in every sector. Yeah, Bob says, in the UK, dyslexia is only a neurodivergence, not seen as a health issue by NICE. Yeah, and this again is different because when we're talking about neurodivergence, we're talking about autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and they're all very, very different. Oh, this is really challenging me today on my language. You lot are a very academic bunch, which is great. So on this, what criticisms of the neurodiversity movement can you think of? A lot of you are very pro, it sounds great to me. Let's see people as nothing to treat. But let's put the shoe on the other foot here. Let's, play devil advocate. What do you think some people might say is the biggest criticisms of the movement, that there is nothing to treat? Or Lucy says, silence is the loudest sound to me. I can't have it. Do you know what, Lucy? People gave me noise cancelling headphones. They seem to give them to like every autistic person these days. And I'm the same. I couldn't hack it. I went stir crazy. I needed to have music playing all the time. But it has to be music that I want, otherwise distracted. We've got putting in silent environments. It's like segregation because everyone deserves the right to socialize. If I was a psychiatrist, the ND movement takes power away from me. Can you hear? Yeah, put them in a silent environment. Okay, great. Any other thoughts on why the neurodiversity movement may be criticized? Do they come from the point of rejection of the demand to adjust to the ND society? Oh, we got, they didn't used to exist. Political, it's just an excuse. Not inclusive. Everyone is ND. Unrealistic. Downplay suffering. We've got historically ND people were seen mainly as people with learning differences or mental health. That is true, Bob, and I think a lot of people still feel that way. I mean, all these reasons are right, and some of them, just seem like, just people like just Karens being Karen. Apologies for that term. But there are some real reasons why some may not like the neurodiversity movement. Oh, so let's have a look at them. Some opposing views of why the movement may not be supported. And some of these are justified, some of these are not. So first of all, belief that providing treatment is best. Some people honestly believe that treating someone is the right thing for them. They may say that society is the way it is and they need support. So medication, different kind of educational establishments are for best. And autistic schools which support individuals. That is still technically a form of treatment, is it not? Or is that different from medication? Or is it just a different form of treatment? Some people who think that treatment is beneficial might not support the movement. You could argue that parents who have children who have ADHD medication may not support the movement, but still have the best intentions at heart. Treatment used to be incarceration in institutions and doors never opened, absolutely. Okay, let's see what else. We've got Big Pharma. This is a really big one that we'll explore a bit more in a minute. Big pharmacological companies, right? It is not in their benefit, right? They make money off of diagnosis. They make money off of people being ill and sick. And the longer the illness, the longer the condition, the better. They're not bothered about fixing the common cold. It comes and it goes. But something like dyslexia, autism, cha-ching, that's not going away anytime soon. And if they can make money off of it, brilliant. Obviously, this is a very skeptical point of view, but I think it'd be quite difficult to argue that companies do not have a monetary incentive in order to say that there is something clinically wrong with you. Parents have seen their kids suffer. This is another one. The neurodiversity movement is quite an empowering movement, but if you see your kids suffering every day, screaming because of oversensitivity, not being able to concentrate and pulling their hair out through the distress, stimming to the point where they just can't move on anymore, or writing and just being such an underachiever despite them being so intelligent. You try and tell the parent that it's a superpower then. I think some of them would really struggle with that concept. And lastly, some people believe that the neurodiversity movement is only created for those who are high functioning. Appreciate that term's now outdated, but we mean those who have low support needs, who are essentially those who are able to mask, to go undercover in public. That is who the movement is for. For those who it is abundantly obvious that they have additional needs, this movement doesn't really kind of include them. Again, you tell me, do you agree or disagree with these? Let's have a quick look at the comments. We've got Bob says, Big Pharma, in my opinion, changed the landscape in the 1950s. No real pharma discoveries apart from the SSSI since. They do tend to focus on ones which are money makers. It makes you wonder, do they really want to cure things like cancer? Again, big questions. Obviously, cancer and neurodiversity completely different. I was just talking about something which they make a lot of money off of. Can't we provide but not mandate or force treatment? What do I feel my needs are? Ask or provide those that don't have much of a voice. Yeah, since you ask someone, but then people who aren't able to consent for other reasons, maybe they do have other mental health issues, maybe they are underage, it raises more challenges. The next question is, the neurodiversity movement is only for high functioning. Now, this one we just mentioned, do you agree or disagree? From what we have said, from the knowledge that you currently have, is this movement only for people who are able to mask their difference in day-to-day life? Gail says, agree that the movement and superpower ideas are only for high functioning. It's hard, isn't it? Because yes, it is empowering, but then if you apply it to the whole spectrum, suddenly it stops being empowering. Oh, Bob disagrees, but with caveats. So the neurodiversity movement is only for the high functioning. Most of you disagree. And from what I believe, if that's a true useful at all, is that it does encompass everyone, because it is saying that thinking differently is kind of biologically normal. It's just about accepting that difference is difference. It's not saying whether or not it's good or bad. You could struggle in day-to-day life. It's not arguing about that. It is just saying that people think differently and that is normal. But yeah, it does make it difficult when you see people who are really in distress. Gail says low functioning. I don't have much experience on. Apologies. Okay, Gail. Well, let me explain it. So it's a bit of an outdated term, right? But high functioning is someone who is, might have autism, for example, but can blend into society. You may not notice them. They might struggle, but they can get by. But someone who is low functioning might struggle to speak, interact, make eye contact. It will kind of be very debilitating. Now, the definition is not perfect, because you could argue that someone who is nonverbal is low functioning. However, they might be a genius. It's also not a great term, because people who were considered high functioning are considered more valuable in society. When we talk about these superpowers, about people being, a great attention to detail, thinking outside of the box, we're talking about a high functioning person. We're not talking about people who society has deemed as less valuable. So it's why that while the term is still used, it's not a great term to use, because it essentially puts some of us on a pedestal and others of us in like the junk pile, which obviously isn't nice. Yeah, Bob says treatment in Germany in the 30s were euthanasia. Unfortunately so. If you were deemed low functioning, off to the gas chambers. If you were considered high functioning, maybe they'd train you to break codes. It wasn't a great time to be alive. We've got, as long as the story is heard, Anna says, I don't like the term high functioning. It's more about what's visible outside and how you are inside. Yeah, I don't like it, but rather than condemn people for using it, I try to explain why it might not be appropriate anymore. And once you kind of peel it back a bit, a lot of people do tend to agree. Anyone out? Any other questions? Oh, yes. We don't always know what difference is a disease, because we don't know what causes it. So another question to put back to you, concerns of any labels at all. So these are some of the things which, why do we have any labels? Psychiatry is heavily dependent on diagnostic clarifications. Do you think that's true or not? Like, do we need labels in order for psychiatry to be a thing? For validity of diagnosis, what do we mean by validity? We mean that evidence, proof, is there evidence that it is a thing? And obviously we can't do tests in order to prove autism, for example. It is something where an individual has to kind of go through different criteria. There's also skepticism on the benefits of a diagnosis. Some people say it doesn't help me at all. You've slapped a label on me. I'm in the exact same situation that I was before. And diagnosis has been used to justify civil detention. And this goes back to what Bob was saying, for many times people have been sent to, excuse my language, the loony bin. People have been gone to concentration camps. People have been sent to special education schools, when in fact that they would have been able to get by in a normal state school. Again, I'm not saying right or wrong, but these are things that have happened that make people re-question the validity of a diagnosis. So let's have a look what most of you have put. Psychiatry is heavily dependent on diagnostic criteria. Yeah, a lot of you agree. I think it is heavily dependent. If you take away diagnosis, you kind of start breaking down the concept of it completely. We don't really understand the diagnosis. That's true. The fact that we can't put people in a scan and say, you got dyspraxia, there's so many rooms for interpretation. We've got skepticism on the benefits of a diagnosis. I would say skepticism is the right word, because I do think there is benefit. but it depends on the circumstances. And diagnosis has been used to justify civil detention. That is true, unfortunately. Even to a lesser approach, some of your decisions in life may have been made for you. Oh, you can't do that because of ... Okay, Claudia says, agree, true, depends. Daniela and Daniel says, I think the word "to" in the statement about psychiatry is really important. Oh, yeah. UK, only 1972 was education available to all. Very true, Bob. So you can see really interesting questions. We don't always know what difference is a disease. So I'll go back to the question just to make sure I don't miss anything at the end. Now, to focus a little bit more on Big Pharma, because Big Pharma is one of the biggest reasons why change is so damn slow, because it isn't in their interest. They've got the money to lobby the government and other kind of organizations. So why does Big Pharma, and when I say Big Pharma, we mean like the real big companies that control like the patents and like the medication and the supply chain, why do they like these labels? Well, them and the medical model, right? So let me read it and break it down, because it is really interesting. It's criticized for being dependent on the pharma industries. So you can't really separate the medical model. In order for like research to happen, they need funding. The Big Pharma funds the research, hence you wouldn't want to upset the people who feed you. The model innovates treatments for common and long-term conditions. So what we're saying, Big Pharma is going to put all its money into developing things which you are going to be reliant on. We know that autism is for life. So if we can create a medication for autism, we are going to be having money for someone's entire lifespan. But if it is no longer a disability or a disease or something we can rid, then that's a massive source of funding that the Big Pharma is going to be missing out on. And this is, with ADHD, which is a more probably of an accurate way, is do all people with ADHD need medication? Big Pharma might say yes, but a lot of us will say no. But obviously there is benefits to some of us. And some of the other criticisms is suppression of negative studies. While research companies that have done research on neurodivergence, because they are funded by these big pharma companies, they might not release all the evidence. And encouragement of new disorders and overdiagnosis. We've all heard about like places in the US where ADHD has skyrocketed. Now, you could argue that's because there's more awareness, or you could say that it's in the benefit of the organizations to diagnose people, particularly if you're going via private organizations. Yeah, and Anna says people also like quick solutions. Exactly. Supporting someone who is ND isn't an overnight thing. It takes a lot of time because we're not even sure ourselves yet. We're still developing and growing in that area. So the Clinical Psychiatry Network, which is just like this group, they created up this like manifesto, and they said this. They share concerns about psychiatric practice when it is heavily dependent on diagnostic clarification and the use of psychopharmacology. What that's essentially saying is they agree. Those two are interlinked. Try get rid of them. You can't, because the system crumbles. The concern reflects their recognition of poor construct validity among psychiatric diagnosis. Again, I apologize, these terms are big. I'm going to try and break it down the best that I know how. So the big concern is that understanding it is very difficult because of the way the diagnoses are so, there's so many room for interpretations. The diversity in being neurodiverse allows for a lot of wiggle room in terms of what is needed support and what isn't. Now, moving on to something which is a bit more up for debate, and I'm genuinely interested in hearing your opinions. Can you think of an alternative to labels altogether? So we talked about, why labels are bad, why we don't agree with them. Let's come up with some innovation. What could we use instead? Or is there something that you would prefer? And we're even talking about the label difference. We're just like, is there something better altogether? We've got the problem psychiatry has is that since diagnostic tests as to what's going on in the brain, psychiatrists have been diagnosed on mostly symptoms alone. This is not necessary with other conditions. Yeah, very true. I think Big Pharma is an evil entity, but I absolutely need my ADHD medication or my brain is unmanageable. I know many people feel that way, and getting the medication in the NHS is really difficult. I know a lot of people who are on benefits who have to pay for their ADHD medication privately. It's one of those necessary evils. Okay, we've got, can you think of an alternative? We've got unique idiosyncrasies, strengths and weaknesses without assuming they'll go together in an ND way. Yeah, I normally just ask people, how does your mind work? What works well for you? What doesn't? This is a good way of stop kind of limiting certain demographics. What have we got? Oh, Gail says maybe low functioning should be changed to hidden attributes. When someone is on the right environment for them, they can flourish. When someone chooses their environment, it is not treatment, it's just choice. Oh, that's a nice way of looking at it. If someone chooses it, it's not treatment. Society currently limits choice. I don't mind labels, I'm proud of mine. Oh, needed for the base for everyone. I don't think that normies have a very good go in the public arena versus education pharma. Systems understand values. No label, just acceptance, understanding. Maybe I'm a dreamer. You're not the only one. So there is an interesting book by Kidman, and Peter Kinderman, I recommend checking it out. Again, it's focused more on mental conditions, but there are quite some interesting parallels you can make from it. And in this manifesto, he discussed a completely new approach to psychiatric care, one that truly offers care rather than coercion. So in this sense, care is when you support someone, coercion is when you tell them this is what's right for you. That's what we mean by coercion. And therapy rather than medication. So speaking with someone rather than dosing them up. Distress is usually an understandable reaction to life's challenges. So what we're saying here is, do people with autism struggle in day-to-day life? I would say yes. Quite often, yes. But we're saying it is understandable to react to life's challenges. This is completely normal. Life is hard. And the way we respond to it, there's nothing wrong about it. So this is some ways that we can work around it. Now, do you kind of agree with Kidman's views? Would you rather approach where we do care first, or do you think coercion? Again, coercion means when a doctor says, all right, this is what you need. So should people choose for themselves, or should a professional tell them? Obviously, you could look at it both ways. As an individual, do you really know what's best for you? Shouldn't a professional do it? Maybe, but maybe it's better to have a joint dialogue. So most of you would say care. Me too. I do think, though, care, but with the consultation and dialogue with a professional. Oh, Emma says, Kidman's theory feels like a red herring to me. Healing happens in communities, in the public sphere, rather than in care, behind locked doors. Oh, that's a nice approach to it. Both joints. Okay, what about his second point? Do you think therapy is better or medication is better? I know what you're probably all saying. There's many different ways, it's not one or all, but it's kind of interesting. He's like splitting it down. So most of you would say therapy. Therapy is not the Western way, unfortunately. It's not a quick fix, but it does change the message that we are helping reframe how you think about problems rather than changing the chemistry within your brain. Thinking about it, medication is quite an extreme thing. You are putting something in your body that changes how your brain functions, and you do not understand it. Medication is a form of therapy. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not saying one nor all, to be honest. Again, not my opinions. It's just interesting to have that debate. I have both therapy and medication, and I think the combination is the right thing for myself. Medication is less expensive. Medication is less expensive, and thus it is normally the quickest thing to prescribe. Lucy says, ADHD meds allow me to function, but we need therapy to go along with it. Just can't afford it. Yeah, therapy is better because medication might function for a period of time, provided the previous circumstances that led to the episode. Yeah, sometimes medication is seen like a plaster, which kind of covers it up, but it doesn't actually heal it. Anna says, meds won't help you. process what is happening and why, absolutely. And Claude says, I'm skeptical of any unnuanced position. Yes. The next question is, what are the positives of a diagnosis / label, no matter what you call it? Again, we've spoken a lot about, what's the alternative? Maybe we don't need one. Maybe how we have it currently is okay. I'm not trying to uproot the whole system. I just want to hold it to account. So Tracy says, my understanding was that medication for ADHD doesn't fix everything. So therapy defo plays a part. Yeah, a combination is good. So we got, what are the positives of a label? Support, shorthand way to communicate others' needs to get help. Yep. Give a name or how we function, being entitled to various kinds of support. It's true, if we had no label, how would we even help people? Imagine these webinars that I do, how would I even get people to attend? Because I wouldn't know what audience to kind of reach. A label isn't perfect, but if nothing had a name, how would we ever talk about it? Oh, Bob says, diagnosis was my life eureka moment. Yeah, and many people who do not have a diagnosis find life even more challenging. Sometimes just having that kind of evidence, that proof, that understanding, that kind of name to attach to something can be incredibly enlightening. So now about reclaiming disorder. Well, Tracy says there's trouble getting a therapy even through the NHS. Is getting a therapist understandable? It's very, very difficult. Gail says labels are key to unlocking doors. Yeah. We've got disorders are appropriate to some forms of neurodivergence. Agree or disagree? Difference between mentally ill and neurodiverse have been extravagated. That's quite a big statement. A harsh diagnosis as an agenda for action is positive, or disorders have a specific meaning, which doesn't need to be overinterpreted. So these are all really good points, okay? And I want to break them down a little bit more if that's okay. So why could disorder not be a bad word to use? Disorders are appropriate for some forms of neurodivergence. For some disorders, like for instance, dyslexia, is it a disorder? I don't know. For some that affects people quite heavily, maybe it is appropriate. Maybe we shouldn't just use this neurodiverse for everything. Differences between mental health and neurodivergence have been blown up. Now, this is again is an interesting one because the neurodiversity movement is trying to separate them really heavily, but they do go hand in hand. When people say to me, are they the same thing? I always say, no, they're not. But they do go hand in hand because being neurodiverse does put you at a higher risk of having poor mental health. It doesn't have to be that way, but it is that way at the moment. So maybe we're focusing too much on separating. A harsh diagnosis as an agenda for action is positive. This is an interesting one as well. They're saying, we need to use these really big names like disorder, disease, terminal, life, ones that kind of really kind of make people's eyes go open. Because if we soften it so much, it's just a difference, we are meaning that getting support is going to be harder and harder. There's always things in our life which are going to require money and funding. If we soften being neurodiverse so much, other things in life are going to get the funding instead, and we will not get the support we need and deserve. And disorders have a specific meaning which shouldn't be overinterpreted. What this is saying is that disorder just means it isn't ordered, and it's a clinical term used for professionals in order to get support for people. We're putting maybe too much emphasis that it's such a negative word rather than what it was originally intended for. Oh, so Bob says, no. Tracy says, Claude says, diagnosis can help identify struggles, promote awareness, promote support, and promote inclusion. Gail says, maybe we are just allergic to anything NT. Possible. I mean, all of these are really interesting points. And who knows, honestly, it's still up for debate. But what are some improvements that would have the biggest impact on being diagnosed? So how can we make a diagnosis even more beneficial or beneficial at all? On this, you just rate which ones have the biggest impact. We've got psychometric testing, which is a more detailed approach doing the standard kind of assessments of speaking. Neuroimaging is when we put people and say, yeah, you got the autism right there, or you got dyslexia. That's something that we can't currently do. Structured assessments, so have things which are tailor-made for particular individuals, or have an updated booklet. So the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. And we're on version 5 at the moment. It's a bit outdated, probably could do with a refresh. Interesting. Honestly, this is so fascinating to see everyone's views. I love a bit of neuroscience myself, so I would love to have more neuroimaging, but the evidence just isn't there at the moment. But if we could find something, that would be great, ideally. All right, let's quickly summarize this. So ultimately, at the end of the day, this is a really, really complex area, and we're not going to come to some sort of like mutual agreement. We also got to appreciate today, we're preached to converted. All of you are probably massive advocates of thinking and being different. Simplistic terms are normally likely wrong. So we try and pick one term, we're probably going to miss out and make a mistake. We like to make things simple. Life's not simple. Diagnostics are helpful in making sense of a person's problems and planning interventions. We can't get around that. They are useful. And as the old expression goes, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is still real use in having a diagnosis. And despite all these different models, none of them are perfect. I can't, though I like some of them, there's not one I would say we should definitely go through. They're all problematic in their own individual way. Here are some of the lovely things that we used in order to generate today's workshop. We are recording this, so you can check this out at a later date. I always talk about assessments. If you're in the UK, get in contact. We might be able to help as an organization, but I won't kind of fix on this, just to round things up. And just to conclude, any last comments? I think, what other ones? We might need recommendations from a professional. Yes, I think we should never neglect the use of a professional. They're professionals for a reason. I think therapy first, along with medication. Also need labels to do research on what helps us. Absolutely. Imagine a life where nothing had a label. It would be so difficult. I agree. Okay, fantastic. Now, that concludes today. What a webinar. This has been one of the best debates we've had, and I really appreciate how everyone's been so mature about it, had really kind of everyone's added, not everyone's agreed, but it's been really useful. Next week, we are going to dive even deeper. This is like Inception. Each week, we're getting deeper and deeper and deeper. Next week, we're going to be looking at a brief history of diagnosis. This isn't going to be just neurodiversity related, but it's going to have more of a focus. But we're going to be looking at how have we diagnosed people over time? Was it just you're a bit funny looking label? Was it kind of brain scans, kind of like seeing how that's evolving? Also a little bit on the future of diagnosis, talking about neuroimaging and brain scans. You can go to our Eventbrite, or you can go to our website, exceptionalindividuals.com. Yeah, and do you know what, Chloe, I agree with you. There hasn't been much focus on dyspraxia. There is unfortunately less research on that area, so that is the key reason, but I will try and include it more. And if you like today and you want to catch up with our previous ones, do go to our YouTube channel and like and subscribe. We have some really interesting subjects that I would love to get more of you participating on and joining. And this is it. Here's the details if you want to get in contact with us. You're all very, very welcome. And I really hope you enjoyed that and you kind of got some use out of it. This wasn't easy. We talked about some really complex issues. So if you didn't understand it all, honestly, do not worry. I have to revisit this stuff all the time, but really interesting. All right, thanks everyone. Thank you so much for your lovely comments. I'm exhausted already. So I'll get planning and get ready for the next week. Thanks, April. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Daniel and Daniela. Thanks, Anna, Tracy, Lucy, Emma, Claude, Indigo, Anthony, Walwa. Thank you so much. Anna loves the sessions. Can't wait to get you back. Wal, thanks, Wal. I appreciate it. All right, great stuff. Bye all.